Thanks everybody for coming to the Homegrown Nature Preserve Hancock County Master Gardeners Educational Series. I want to present Elaine Whitfield. She's a gold Master Gardener, which means how many hours? 1,000 volunteer hours. That's amazing. So Elaine is so kind to talk about the woody alternatives for to take over, so we don't have to be planting invasive species like burning bush. So I'm hoping you'll tell us a good alternative for burning bush. Good, I'm excited. And then Mary will be joining us afterwards to also share. I love all your pictures and everything, so I'm excited about this. And I'm sure we'll have a question between there. So, all right, go take it away, Elaine.
All right. Well, if you saw the one that I did last month, it was on more of herbaceous plants, and we're going to be talking about the woody natives this time. So we're going to start off with, let's see if this works. Of course not.
And maybe I need batteries again.
Okay, we're going to, yeah, it might be the battery thing. We're going to talk about shrubs, first of all, native shrubs. And, oh, let me first mention that some of these different specimens that I'm going to talk about can be either tree or shrub-like. It just depends on the species, and some of them you can train to be shrub. You typically think of them as trees, or vice versa. Okay, next.
Oh,
it worked.
You did it that time.
It worked that time. I'm so surprised. Okay, and this first one I'm going to talk about is called Ninebark. And I'm not going to pronounce the botanical name, but you can see it there on the screen. Now, on the left-hand side of the screen, that's my Ninebark. And you can see it has kind of a plum-colored leaf, but there's also a green leaf variety. So same species, it's just, I believe this one on the left-hand side is more of a cultivar of the green leaf one. But they're both beautiful. They have these lovely flowers. They're a larval host for many different moths. They can be used for songbird nesting because of their limb structure. They don't get real tall, but tall enough that songbirds would feel safe in them. They have wonderful, attractive fall color. Now, the one I have doesn't change a lot of the color in the fall, but the green leaf one does. They can be used for erosion control to hold back banks. I can think of a place out back here that could use a few Ninebarks. And they'll do part shade to full sun. They're fairly tolerant of light conditions and adapts to a wide range of soil types. So you don't have to worry about soil pH and so forth. And they're drought tolerant. So it's a workhorse in the garden. And actually, when I bought my Ninebark, it was a poor little scrubby looking wilted thing sitting in a big box store garden center, and I got it for half price. And I said, I'm taking this home and I'm nursing it, and I did, and it's a beautiful shrub about this tall now, and it's been about 4 or 5 years ago. So yes, I got some looks from the garden center people. Here we have a real live one. She'll buy anything. Okay, let's see if I can advance this. Now it's not working. And another shrub variety I want to talk about. And this is a rather large family called Viburnum. And in Indiana, we have somewhere around 10 native species, and not all of them are in the same place. If you look at Viburnum distribution, there's some that are specifically in northern Indiana around the lakes area, and then there's some southern Indiana types. Here in central Indiana, we have several. And you may see some of them blooming out in the spring in some of our wooded areas. And we'll talk about this specific one here. Maple leaf is one that's common to central Indiana. And there's the lovely flower on the left-hand side. And this is a fall color with the berries that they produce. So it's a very attractive plant. It's 3 to 6 feet tall, so it would go in a small yard. Attracts birds and butterflies. In fact, this is how I got to know about viburnums. Was my neighbor across the street was really into birding, and she planted a bunch of viburnums for the to attract the birds because they produce a lot of berries, and the butterflies like the flowers. They take, again, excuse me, they can tolerate full sun, part shade. But one thing you'll have to remember is if you want a viburnum, you need, in order to get a lot of fruit production, you'll need another viburnum, a different species from what, like the maple leaf you would plant. And if you look at some of your gardening books or go online, it'll tell you what, excuse me, what other viburnum would be a good match to be a cross-pollinator for that variety. Okay, next slide. Excuse me, and another viburnum that we have in central Indiana is the black haw. And as you see, again, the flower on the left looks very similar to the maple leaf one, but they all kind of have that round-headed or flat-topped umbral of flowers. And as you see in the right-hand photograph, who wants a burning bush if you can have color like this in the fall? Really, it's a very attractive plant and produces lots of berries, and it gets 4 to 8 feet tall, a little bit bigger than the maple leaf. Again, a great food source for birds and wildlife. And it, as I said, wonderful fall color, and it's easy to transplant. Okay, we'll go on. Now we'll get into the trees. Let's see if this works. Oh, go ahead. And I know everyone is familiar with the willow tree, or if you live in central Indiana or in Indiana, anywhere, you should know it's our state tree. It's a quite popular yard tree. It does get quite large, so you do want to plan ahead. If you live in a little postage stamp lot, you may not want a tree this big. However, and it does get very tall. So you want to watch out for power lines and so forth if you plant a tree near the street. Very long lived. Someone has researched to tree lives, and they can live up to 400 years. Host for, excuse me, the tiger swallowtail butterfly, which is up here in the upper right-hand corner. The male is this colorful yellow one, and then sometimes the females are this darker color, but if you look at the tips of the wings, they have that traditional blue and with yellow dots along the margins. And this is the larval stage, or the caterpillar, and they like to crawl up in the tippy tops of the tulip trees. And so they're really kind of hard to find, unlike monarch caterpillars, which are down low where you can hunt them, but that's their close tree. And we'll go on to the next slide. And everyone probably has seen a redbud at some point in their life if you live in this part of the country. Very popular yard tree. There.
I'm sorry, I did that. I'm sorry.
That's okay. There we go. Now it's one, and you think of it when you, excuse me, if you're out in wooded areas, but it actually is a tree that likes the edge of the woods. It does not, it's not an understory tree because it needs some sun. Another good tree for a small yard only achieves about 20 feet in height. And I did not know this till I did a little more research. Some of the redbuds that get larger and as they get larger, they get a limb structure that songbirds can use for nesting. And plus they produce all these seed pods here that are very protein rich, and they can consume the seeds. Now this is the green form. This is right after they've been formed, but they usually turn like a brown color in the fall. And I find the seeds germinating little redbud trees in all my pasta beds and places like that in my yard. So once they get going, they're very prolific. But digging one up is a real trick. Okay, next slide. Now then, I got familiar with pawpaw tree when Thornwood opened, the nature preserve down the road here. And Thornwood has a lot of pawpaw trees. And they are a tree typically of floodplain, so you'll see them if you ever go out to Thornwood. You're going to look for them down on the lower level, not up in the higher mesic woods. But they need a little bit of sun in order to produce a crop. But they are they grow where there's an opening in the canopy, and they're a fairly small tree. They have this beautiful flower. I love this flower, although it has wonderful odor. Pollinated by blowflies and carrion beetles. I knew someone who recommended a friend of theirs put one of these trees near their kitchen window. It was a practical joke.
Oh, no.
Yeah. I don't think they're friends anymore. Anyway, it's I can't think about that or I'll start laughing. Anyway, the wrong one. Zebra swallowtail does feed on the young leaves. And it's a beautiful butterfly. And Joe said he's seen a number of them out there at Thornwood. So they really do attract these wonderful butterflies. Here's a picture of their fruits. These are wonderful. We managed to get a few of them before the animals took them off the trees. You have to be really careful, really sly, and sneak out there and get it, or they'll be hanging on the tree one day and gone the next, just totally consumed, because the mammals love them. And the deer will not browse the trees because the leaves contain a chemical substance that actually upsets their tummy, I guess. I don't think it kills them. It doesn't, they don't want to browse them anymore. So, you know, if you have a little floodplain area in your backyard, and you're worried about deer coming up, they won't bother the pawpaw. Okay, we'll do one more here. This is one of my quirky obsessions, I guess you would call it. You can ask anybody that works with me out here in the demo gardens. If I see a little eastern red cedar sprout coming up out here, I get my spade, dig it up, and I take it home and pot it. And I donate them to the Avon Learning Center because they use these because they're native trees. They use them to use as a screen or a block because there's a railroad going through there and there's other urban development. And they are perfect for that. But they're very long-lived. I did not know that they could live to 900 years. That's an old tree. But they're actually not a cedar. They're actually in the juniper family. And they produce these like typical juniper type berries. They're a pioneer species. It means that if you've ever seen any areas that have been eroded or damaged, or like I've seen like in old coal mining areas, these come up where they've gone in and stripped the surface of the earth off, and these will repopulate in those damaged areas. The cedar waxwing, any bird lovers here? I know Janet probably knows what a cedar waxwing is. They love these berries, among other things. And some mammals eat them too. But beware, it's an alternate host for the cedar apple rust, which is a fungal disease. So if you have apples, or if you live down the road from an apple orchard, they probably would appreciate if you didn't plant one of these trees, because there's a possibility of getting that rust in a crop. And believe that's it. My references that I used are here. If anyone is interested in researching more of native trees and shrubs, these two books written by the Weekses, and then this one was George Parker helped him with the tree part of it. But these are both good tree books and shrub books for the Midwest, for the area that we live in. And they have wonderful maps that show you where the distribution, the natural distribution of these trees and shrubs are. So you can have a good idea of this is going to work in my yard or my farm or what have you. And the 101 Trees of Indiana book, we have at home, is pretty dog-eared because we've used it a lot. It's a wonderful reference. And also Mike Amoya has some wonderful suggestions for small trees in his books, especially if you have a wooded area, you want to do something around it. And then, of course, I consult with Missouri Botanical Gardens because a lot of the things that grow there are also native here. So, any questions?
Can you hear me, Elaine?
Yes.
There's a question from Mary Ann. Mary Ann, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the group?
Hi, Elaine.
Yes.
Or Mary, whichever. So I have a question about the pawpaw. Are there more than one type of pawpaw? Some at Schramm Nature Reserve are short, about the 4 foot, like you said, but some are very tall, up to 10 foot. if you go to southern Indiana, the pawpaw is huge. And it just seems like some of them that I see just don't get that tall. So I don't know. Interesting question.
I've only known, well, I would say the ones that grow around here, I think there's just one species that I know of. Now, if you go to Stark Brothers catalog online, they have about 5 different varieties, but those could be hybrids.
Well, but in Schramm, really, we have 2 different kinds. We have the very tall, and then we have the shorter ones.
Well, yeah, but
I mean, and the ones at Schramm, the shorter ones, have been like that for 10 years. They're not growing tall.
I'll go ahead and just give my 2 cents. It's different species. And so if the growing conditions are perfect, they're going to get a lot larger. They're colony formers. So sometimes you'll see a whole stand of them, and it could just be all one plant. So I think it's just where you're at in the state, and then also where you're, what type of habitat it's in, I would say. But I don't know more than one pawpaw here in Indiana.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was gonna say, out there at Thornwood, we have both types. We have the short ones that are more under a cover, and the taller ones are out in the open, basically. So
they have
we get both
an
types.
opening in the canopy.
Yeah, it depends on the canopy.
Any others?
I have a question. How long does it take for the pawpaw tree to produce pawpaws?
I don't honestly know. Do you know, Joe? Since
Off the
you-
top of my head. I was reason where I was thinking, well, it's gotta get matured, and it's gotta be in this, it's had to have access to sun before it'll produce fruit.
Yeah, because some may never produce if they're in too much
If they're
shade.
too much shade.
So it kind of depends on the location.
I have 2, and I was so surprised that the deer wasn't eating them. I didn't
That's
know that
why.
I didn't know they didn't like them. I just thought they didn't, that they were,
Yeah,
missed them.
And
If they're good eating if you can beat the animals to, just don't eat the skin and don't eat the seed. Poisonous part.
Mom has. Okay.
And I had a question about the cedar trees. Are those the same type cedar trees that you see growing on the mountains that pop up by themselves? Is that the red eastern cedar trees?
Yeah.
And they're all
They're-
shaped kind of barrel looking shape, and they're
Yeah.
all up and down? Cause I dug up
There's-
3 cedar trees that was around my house, and I've got those in pots, so I was just wondering if it was the same tree.
Yeah, I only know of the one, the eastern red cedar typically is, from Mississippi River east. I think they typically, that would be the same tree that you're talking about.
Right, cause
That
you
they
see a
would-
lot of them, and they just pop up along the
Yeah.
mountains,
Well,
along
we
the
get 'em out.
edges.
We get them out here. We have a couple of
Mhm.
adults, and then next thing you know, we have 4 or 5 little ones coming up next to the sidewalk out here. Any other questions? All right.
Thank you, Elaine.
You'll get you a clear. Oh, thank you.
thank you, Elaine. Always so good to hear your experience with native plants. Well, I thank you, everybody that's in the live studio audience and all of those that are tuning in remotely. It's been a really fun series that we've had, so I've really enjoyed myself. So I'm going to probably put the questions minimized right now, but feel free to unmute yourself or speak up if you have questions midstream, or we can answer them at the end. So we talked about herbaceous plants last time, and this time we're going to talk about a little bit more of the trees, the shrubs, and even some woody vines in relation to some very common invasive plants used in landscape. My name, for anyone that may not know, is Mary Wells. I'm a regional specialist with SICM. We are a organization that's a nonprofit that was working in Southern Indiana, and now we're working statewide. This is our map, our coverage. We have a lot of services that we offer. And we also are working with each county or multiple county groups to form local organizations to raise awareness and control invasive species. So we call those cooperative invasive species management areas. This is Hamilton County's group, and this is the group in my home county, Monroe County. And these are the SISMAs that are currently at some level of organization in Indiana. The ones that are blue are organized, they have a name, they have mission, they have events planned, and they have goals and objectives. Ones that are orange are kind of in the organizational stage. They've gone through some of the steps, but not all of them. And the ones that are green, including those of you that are here from Hancock County, we need to start meeting if possible. We just had our first SISMA call out. So we'll stay tuned because we may be starting to have that organizational series of events to build a SISMA if we get enough momentum. And these are the logos from the ones that do have logos throughout the state. I'm going to do a very, very quick review of native versus invasive in case anyone's tuning in for the first time. And then we'll get into the fun stuff, the woody invasive plants, and the native alternatives, and then just a few options to learn more and get involved. So we've talked about what a native species is, and I threw another one in here that I thought you all might laugh at, but this is a definition we love. It's from a book called The Living Landscape by Richard Dark and Douglas Tallamy. So just kind of scrolling through some native species or plants, animals, etc., that have evolved in a given place over a period of time sufficient to develop complex and essential relationships with the physical environment and other organisms in a given ecological community. So very open-ended. And then we have the cicada. I don't think they're emerged or singing up there very much yet, but it's very loud down here in Monroe County, and I'm really excited. So don't forget, it's native and we need to respect these species. They've been alive for 17 years. On the other side of that is an invasive species. We have the garlic mustard, which we were just pulling out at Thornwood a couple weekends ago. Emerald ash borer, zebra mussels, Asian carp. There's a lot here in Indiana. There's lots of negative impacts. I won't go through them all, but you know, it's not just natural areas, it's us too that are being affected. And invasive species are affecting our biodiversity, and we're part of biodiversity. We're not exempt from the natural areas around us. We're dependent upon them. And we're seeing canaries in the coal mine, the monarch population declines, our bird population declines, insect diversity and biomass declining, loss of various types of ecosystems, whether it's eastern broadleaf forest or rainforest. So we've got a lot of things we need to try to work on. And one of them is managing invasive species, because they are a top threat to biodiversity, if not the very top one, because we know the top one is human development and all the other results of that. So just talking about our monarchs and our songbirds, native plants specifically are the backbone of our ecosystems and all biodiversity. So without native plants, we don't have the food chain that they support, or food web. Invasive species all came in from us for the most part. And then they were from there spread by other continue to be spread by us by repeated introductions, whether it's from our landscape or agriculture, or accidental ones from, using aquarium stock or not cleaning our boats between bodies of water, large equipment, the soles of our shoes, the paws of our pets, and then wildlife. The ones that I've highlighted in red, we have an option, we have means, and we have big brains, and we can figure out how to stop the spread via those methods. About 99% of the invasive woody plants that have escaped into North America were intentionally introduced for either landscaping, that's ornamental, or erosion control, or for agriculture or production forestry. So only 1% were accidental. The rest of them, we intentionally brought them in. We brought them in over and over again. So Calorie Pear on our streets, another neighborhood here in my county, and then just down the road, Calorie Pear spreading behind the bus stop. And in front of that is actually, I should point out, is another invasive, that's miscanthus or Chinese silvergrass, which is also spreading. And then it's creeping into our right-of-ways and roadsides, and then taking over an entire forested area. If you don't know about the terrestrial plant rule, let me know, but we have 45 plants that were recently restricted. And of those, about 20 to 22 were ever in the nursery trade at one point. And today, these are the ones that we'll be talking about, and then giving you some alternatives along with some other invasives. And just reminder, as gardeners, we must be vigilant. A lot of these invasive plants are still sold. Not all of them are regulated. And even the most careful of us can be fooled. Plants can be mislabeled. There can be multiple plant names. If you're buying a seed mix, sometimes it can have a contaminant, or if it's a pollinator mix, it could have a potentially an invasive species in there. A lot of those pollinator mixes are really don't always contain species that should be here in Indiana. And if you're buying from online sellers, make sure they're a good seller, that they're not just trying to make money and whatnot. And then moving soil, mulch, various types of amendments into your garden can sometimes bring invasive species and propagules. So this is burning bush, which is still legal for sale. And then this is purple winter creeper in disguise. And this is a variegated cultivar that has accidentally been sold at nurseries, or been for sale at nurseries since the rule. So they've stopped, they've caught a few of these from leaving the store, but I'm sure some of them are out there. So if you see an invasive species, you can report it. And then just a reminder, weedy or aggressive does not necessarily mean a plant is invasive. We have Virginia creeper, which makes a great ground cover and supports wildlife, like this beautiful catbird. And then our common blue violet, which is a great yard plant, I'm not going to call it a weed, supports our fritillary butterflies. So those caterpillars can only use the foliage of violets or native violets to become adult butterflies. Without violets, we don't have fritillaries. Native alternatives serve a lot of the same functions as the kind of traditional non-native landscape plants that we've grown a little bit too used to. Natives can have beautiful flowers. They can provide ground cover, have that fall or winter interest or color, provide privacy and structure. And like we talked about with the pawpaw, they can provide edible fruits or nuts. There are some alternatives to invasive plants that are not native, but considered non-invasive. But at this point, we kind of need to just rethink all of our landscape choices and use natives as much as possible, because wildlife really requires it. We have less and less habitat out there. And so our yards are the new habitat. So that's why we're calling this the Homegrown Nature Preserve series. So let's talk about plants specifically. So we're going to watch out for woody invasive ground covers and vines. Does anyone want to guess what this plant is? And I should say the photo credit is mine, not Don Slack's. I didn't update that one. We'll talk about this in a minute, but this is Asian bittersweet or Oriental bittersweet. It's a monster. So purple winter creeper, I showed you that little tiny little variegated guy. This is the monster in its natural state. It's a climber, but also a ground cover. It's evergreen. It can climb up to 50 feet, and it can overtop shrubs and then also take down trees due to the heaviness of the vines in the winter. It has leaves that are oppositely arranged. They have a toothed edge. They're shiny. When it climbs up, it produces flowers and then those fruits, and that's how it's spread. The birds will eat the fruits and deposit it elsewhere. And this one, again, is regulated. And that's the current distribution. So it's quite heavily here in Indiana. English ivy is not technically related, but I think it's a cousin of a winter creeper. It's a very common landscape plant, evergreen, leathery leaves. It's actually a climber as well, a little slower growing, but once it grows up a tree, it gets really heavy, and it can really harm a mature tree. And the leaves are toxic, so nothing really can eat it. You can't even use goats to control it. And the fruits, unfortunately, they may or may not be good for birds, but they'll still spread it. And it forms these monocultures where not much else can grow. And it's also very widespread here in Indiana. So we talked about some of the alternatives last week, but I just want to reiterate, sedges are awesome. There's a sedge for almost every growing condition. They're grass-like plants. You don't really need to mow because they never get too tall, especially the ones that I've recommended here. And when they're planted in mass, they just grow together and form this really nice texture in whatever type of garden. There's only really the only type of area that sedge wouldn't work is something that's really, really dry and sunny. Otherwise, you can probably find a sedge that works for that particular type of garden. So gray sedge likes it a little shady, a little wet. Porcupine sedge can deal with part shade and normal soil. Same with eastern star sedge and white sedge and seersucker sedge. I just threw in bristleaf sedge. You can purchase it, but it's not technically native. But I really love this planting treatment over at a garden in Missouri. It's a part of the Missouri Botanical Garden properties. Ferns, we have so many native ferns. I didn't even get them all in here, but I would say cinnamon ferns are really fun because it's a huge fern with nice texture of the fronds and the cinnamon stick fertile fronds. Sensitive fern if you have a little bit of a wet area. Maidenhair fern if you've got nice humusy soil in the shade. Pretty much all of them are going to need some amount of shade. And some wildflowers that are good ground covers are also alternatives. I would say the top one for these evergreen vines is golden ragwort. It's the yellow one in the bottom corner, and it has the benefit of being evergreen, even if it's not a vine. And then in the spring, you get a sea of yellow flowers when it's in mass. Dwarf crested iris is a great shady ground cover. Wild stone crop, our golden alexanders and blue mist flower if you have an area that gets a little bit more sun and is wet. And then wild ginger is also a top substitute for winter creeper and English ivy.
Mary?
Yes.
I have a question, it's Mary in White Rock, about
Hi.
the wild ginger.
Mm-hmm.
Ginger just seems to keep taking over spaces. And so to me, it's kind of aggressive, but I mean, I know it's not listed as an invasive. So I don't know. Can you speak about that? It just seems to be taking over.
Well, we're suggesting ginger because it is such a good spreader and it's native. There are non-native gingers in the landscape trade. There's a lot of Asian gingers. You want to avoid those because I can't speak to how aggressive they might be and if they can escape into natural areas. But wild ginger, it's native. It can't be considered invasive. And if it's too much, then it's maybe just not in the right area. But when you're thinking about substitutes for English ivy and winter creeper, the reason we like those so much, or why they become so popular, is that they are very, they spread and really fill in, because nature abhors a vacuum, and so we like these as ground cover. But if you don't want it in a certain area, then it's maybe not that place for that particular plant. But
Well, I didn't plant it. It just kind of came around, probably by a bird seed or something. And it's just kind of taken over in this one part of the yard over here. And so it just, every year it seems to duplicate itself times 2 or more.
it spreads by rhizomes, and that's what is happening. So you can stop it and move it to a place that you like a little bit better. Thank you, Mary Ann. Okay, moving on. So this is that Oriental Bittersweet. This is the one that we brought in as a craft arrangement. It has kind of roundish leaves, but it actually hybridizes with our native bittersweet, which has lance-shaped leaves. And the hybrid is just as much of a monster. And then it produces those orange fruits. The native that we have has orange fruits, but not as deep orange. And it only produces fruits at the end. I have a photo of that one in a minute. And this one it's pretty widespread. It's coming down from the Chicago region and then up from southern Indiana. And it's really hard to control. So if you know that you have this, or you think you might have it, don't hesitate to reach out, because we would not want you to have a big problem. It can cover acres of land when it's really infested. Japanese honeysuckle. It's a vining honeysuckle that's related to the invasive bush honeysuckle species. It smells really good, and it's about to start blooming throughout Indiana. And it's semi-evergreen. It gets those white flowers. It has leaves that can be lobed or simple, and the flowers have really fragrant nectar, and it produces black fruits that are spread by birds. This one likes it a little sunny, so it's not going to do well in the shade. But if you have like a wooded edge, it can take over, and it can take over a lot of ground. So it's really not an easy one to control either. And it can wrap around small trees and girdle them, or cover understory plants and shrubs, creating nothing but little pockets of honeysuckle vine. It's very widespread. It's very bad in Indiana, but it's even worse south of here. Chinese wisteria. This is another big woody vine. And I should specify, Japanese honeysuckle, while technically woody, doesn't really get that thick of a vine, unlike wisteria. Also Japanese wisteria, they're very similar and hard to tell apart. And I showed you that vine first just because it's massive, just like bittersweet. So it has compound leaves, and the invasive bittersweets have fuzzy little fruits or seed pods. We do have a Native American bittersweet, has seed pods that are smooth and rounded, no hairs at all. And this one usually flowers before it produces leaves. So that's one way to know you might have the invasive, is if it's flowered before it leaves out. And really beautiful flowers, and they smell good, I know, but I've seen this covering acres and acres of property. So if you can, substitute with the American, it's equally beautiful and less aggressive. And I think that these might be some underreported areas, and it's not even showing Marion County, and I've personally seen it in Marion County. So these are some native vine alternatives. That's my word, sorry. So American bittersweet, you can see in the upper left, it only has the fruits at the end of the vine, and so only flowers at the end of the vine. And just I've seen it, it looks really nice in a landscape, but it's just not as, doesn't have as many fruits. Our native virgin's bower, I just left that in here. Wild yam, woolly Dutchman's pipevine, and moonseed vine. They're semi-woody, but not super, they don't have really thick woody stems. And then there's that American wisteria, and you can see the flower is appearing right alongside the leaf. Coral honeysuckle, which is a perfect alternative to the Japanese honeysuckle. Beautiful color, not fragrant that I'm aware of, but a really nice landscape plant. I have it growing in my landscape, and I'm very happy with how it grows and what how many flowers it produces. And then crossvine, it looks similar to the more aggressive native hummingbird vine or trumpet creeper vine. Similar flower, but not as aggressive. So a good landscape plant. And then we'll talk about keystone flora amongst the vines. So the woolly pipevine, swallowtail butterfly likes the pipevine plant. Our moonseed vine produces fruits that are popular with birds like cedar waxwings. Greenbrier, which we didn't talk about, but it's not a real good landscape plant, but it's a really common vine here in Indiana. Virginia creeper, which I mentioned, supports songbirds and game birds with its fruits. And that coral honeysuckle supports a lot of insects, birds, and small mammals. We even threw poison ivy in there because, yes, it's a native. I actually leave it in areas of my landscape that I don't need to frequent, and because I know that it does support a lot of wildlife. So let's talk about these shrubs. This is burning bush, and this is in Tippecanoe County. So it's bad here in Indiana, unfortunately. So, and it's still unfortunately legal, but we're working on getting it added to the regulations. Another one that is not legal, but is very common in our landscape still, is Japanese barberry. It has often red leaves, sometimes green, depending on the cultivar. Not a very tall shrub. It usually gets about 3 to 5 feet max, and then produces fruits. And that's the problem. The birds are eating the fruits and spreading it. It has thorns. It produces thickets, and those thickets become the perfect home for our the larval host of black-legged ticks, which carry Lyme disease. And so we are getting infestations like this throughout Indiana. And when we have heavy infestations, it's been shown with multiple studies that and when we clear out these infestations, then the tick populations go down, and so does the incidence of tick-borne illness. And that's the current reported distribution map for this species. Autumn olive is another regulated plant. It was brought in as a wildlife species because the fruits are pretty delicious. It's very common along our roadsides. It was planted intentionally as a windbreak. And now it's illegal. It has a lot of flowers. It's probably flowering still up there in Hancock County. And then the fruits that it produces are red and very delicious. It alters our soil and changes the amount of nitrogen that gets captured. And it is basically inhibits the growth of native plants, but favors the growth of autumn olive and other invasives. And it's all over because we introduced it. And this is wing burning bush. So that red is why we plant it. It turns a really pretty color in the fall. It was my father's favorite landscape shrub. I remember him planting it at pretty much every house we ever lived at. It's known as winged burning bush because occasionally the stems will get a quirky wing appendage on them, that brown area, and then the fruits. I haven't seen a burning bush without fruits, and when it produces those fruits, the birds are able to spread it. And it's very adaptable in a natural area. And this is the current distribution map. I would say it's probably been in every county I've ever visited. And then privet. So we have several privets that are invasive. The worst of the bunch is the blunt-leaved or border privet, and that's the one that's regulated. And that's the one I see most commonly, though I have seen a couple other species out there. It looks a little bit like a honeysuckle. It's got those opposite leaves. However, the flowers are at the end of the stem, and it's usually a little bit shorter, and it has a very gray uniform bark. And then when it produces fruits, they're black, and they usually kind of stick around over winter because the birds don't like them, but when they get really hungry, they'll eat them, and it makes them sick. So eventually they'll eat them and spread them. and it's all over Indiana. Asian bush honeysuckles. So we have several species here and a hybrid. So 4 species and a hybrid. The one depicted here is the most common, the Amur honeysuckle. And it was introduced as an ornamental, but it hasn't really been commonly for sale for a while, but people just let it grow up because it forms a pretty easy hedge or privacy hedge. But it does a lot more than more damage than good. The branches are kind of stripy, tan, kind of arch shaped, similar flowers to the honeysuckle vine, but not as fragrant and a little bit earlier. And then the fruits are usually red, sometimes orange. So this one will suppress growth underneath it. Which contributes to soil erosion. When birds nest in this particular species and some of the other shrubs, it has really poor branching structure, and sometimes cardinals don't know better, they get fooled. And so we're seeing higher levels of nest predation when birds build their nests and lay their eggs in these invasive shrubs. Another thing is that there has been studies showing that the higher incidence of tick populations of tick-borne illness with heavy infestations of Asian bush honeysuckle. And heavy infestations of Asian bush honeysuckle can reduce forest growth up to 50% and can obviously suppress regeneration of young trees. And so very widespread here in our state. So let's talk alternative. I kind of threw them in kind of haphazard. We've talked about some already. We've talked about black haw and Ninebark already. And both of those are blooming now or just wrapping up their flowers. We have a lot of native dogwood shrubs. One of them is the red osier dogwood with the red twig that's blooming now or pretty soon up there. Another one that's a small tree or a large shrub, chokecherry. Really great wildlife tree. And then one, if you have a little wetter area, the indigo bush, super showy. It's a good alternative to butterfly bush and just a pollinator magnet. Gorgeous plant. Other native shrub alternatives that are a little bit later flowering. One of my favorites is smooth hydrangea. It's a native hydrangea that they use to make a lot of cultivars. The Annabelle cultivar is the cultivar of smooth hydrangea. However, Annabelle is a cultivar that has only sterile flowers, those little white snowballs, and lacks those center flowers in that cluster, which support pollinators. And this is amazing for me. I have a ton of this in my yard and it's covered in bumblebees and other little bees. So I'm really happy that I ended up with the straight species. We have a lot of native roses here in Indiana. Swamp rose is one of them. We have Carolina rose and we have a climbing rose. Trying to remember the name of that one, but I don't have it on the tip of my tongue. Buttonbush is another really fun native that has those golf ball shaped and sized flowers. It does tend to like it a little bit wet, as does swamp rose, but they can also grow well in regular garden soil conditions, as long as it's not too dry. American elderberry is a gorgeous plant to have, again, and if you have an area that's wet to medium soil moisture. Beautiful flowers, and then also really interesting fruits. You can use the flowers for elderberry liqueur and the fruits for elderberry syrup. New Jersey tea is a diminutive native, which isn't as common as most. I'd say New Jersey tea and Ninebark and smooth hydrangea are the 3 smaller native plants or native shrubs for landscaping. New Jersey tea is fairly adaptable. It does tend to like soils that are drier and it needs full sun. But when it's in flower and it gets covered in all those little tiny white flowers, it only gets about 2 to 3 feet tall. And it's just a really magical plant once it's blooming. And then lead plant, technically a subshrub. It's kind of a woody herbaceous plant, semi-woody herbaceous plant. And it's related to that indigo bush. It's kind of the counterpart for dry conditions, and really beautiful, interesting flowers. Great pollinator magnet, but again, it just doesn't like very moist conditions. It wants drier soils. So shrubs with showy fruits. I like shrubs. Shrubs are my new perennial. I'm a convert. So we have Nannyberry Viburnum. Another viburnum has beautiful flowers and then fruit and also fall color. American hazelnut, I've been planting as a bush honeysuckle alternative because of its growth habit, and it produces, once it gets mature, nuts that you can eat. You do need several, they say at least 3 to 5 to get enough cross-pollination. We have other dogwood shrubs. The gray dogwood and the rough leaf dogwood produce white fruits. We have silky dogwood, which produces blue fruits. American plum, which be considered a small tree or a large shrub, actually does have edible fruits. The straight species, I'm not sure, you might get lucky and get one that tastes really good, but sometimes they aren't super delicious to humans, but birds and other wildlife really enjoy them. And then spice bush for the shade. Those waxy red fruits are really great for the birds and other wildlife. And then I should just take a moment and bask in the fall color on some of these other native shrubs. So fragrant sumac is a really wonderful burning bush alternative. They even have a cultivar called Grow Low that only gets about 2 feet tall and about 6 feet wide. So it makes almost a nice ground cover shrub. American witch hazel gets beautiful yellow color in the fall, and it can deal with sun or part shade. Winged sumac, if you've got an area that can take give it a lot of room to spread. It is a colony forming small tree or large shrub, but it produces fruits that are amazing for wildlife, and that fall color is just dazzling. Black chokeberry is another excellent burning bush substitute. The fall color, it's got a shorter growth habit. You can even get cultivars that stay fairly small and then produces really large black fruits that the wildlife enjoy. Winterberry holly is a native deciduous holly. So it has beautiful fruits that overwinter, but then the leaves turn yellow and fall eventually, but the yellow color of the leaves is really stunning. And you do need male and female on that one, so make sure you get at least 1 male plant with your Winterberry holly purchase. And another Viburnum Arrowwood viburnum, really beautiful plant, has beautiful flowers, fruits, and then really nice fall color. And they do make cultivars, or they do sell cultivars that are fairly low growing. Goodness, now on to some more invasives. So this is Calorie Pear again, over in my county. But first we'll talk a little bit about Norway maple. It's a very common landscape tree. It's a large tree. Looks very similar to sugar maple, but I'm just stopping and showing you the bark because sugar maple bark is usually flatter and has more plaques. And it, it's obviously branched just like all of our maples. And it has very palmate shaped leaves. So distinctly 5 to 7 sharp points. And then the fruits of this tree look more like a coat hanger versus the sugar maple, which has more of a horseshoe shaped samara or winged helicopter. The other way to know that you have Norway instead of sugar maple is if you pick a leaf and you squeeze the base of the leaf stem, it'll have a milky sap instead of a clear sap for sugar maple. And this is the distribution. And it's an understory invader, so it colonizes shady woodlands. And I've seen it growing quite frequently whenever I'm on site visits to natural areas. Mimosa, this is a very cute tree. I know it's adorable, but it's a terrible invasive tree. It's a nitrogen fixture. It's a legume. It grows all along waterways. I lived in Georgia for a year or so, and it's really bad in the south, and it's coming north. So I just want to convince everybody to not try to grow this and add it to their landscaping. It does seed aggressively, and once it's established, it's very hard to control. This is the current distribution, reported distribution map. And of course, Calorie Pear. Can't talk bad about this one enough. It blooms in the spring. It's an ornamental pear that no longer stays in our landscaping. The cultivars that we have are Cleveland Select, Bradford Pear, White House, Red Spire, the list goes on. It was introduced for root grafts for the pears that we eat, and then also introduced eventually for landscaping. And now there's enough cultivars out there that they produce these brown fruits that are spread by birds, most typically spread by another invasive species, the European starling. And it forms thickets, and you can't have a fallow field hardly anywhere in Indiana anymore because of this species. So let's talk about some tree alternatives, some small to medium trees. So peach leaf willow, I think willows, the native willows are not always the best landscape trees, but of all of them, I think peach leaf willow makes a nice small tree in a landscape. Our native service berries, of which downy service berry is my favorite. Spring blooming and then amazing fruits for our birds, and supports a lot of insects and other wildlife. One of my other favorites is Pagoda Dogwood. It's kind of a small tree or multi-stemmed shrub, depending on how you look at it, but it has very nice lateral branching. So it's a nice privacy screen, and then produces these neat flower clusters and fruits, as does green hawthorn and some of our other native hawthorns. I have to put a plug in for Ohio Buckeye. It's a very common tree here in our woodlands, but I love it. It makes me happy in the spring. It produces flowers early and these really interesting fruits, and it does support a lot of insects that use the foliage for food. We have a small understory tree known as American hornbeam, also known as blue beech or musclewood. And it can make a really nice landscape tree if it's just kind of at the edge of a wooded area, as does the eastern wet redbud that we talked about with Elaine. And then, of course, flowering dogwood is the old standby for a native tree to add to your landscape. So typically, I would say you need a little bit of part shade for flowering dogwood. It doesn't like full sun. It never lives as long when it's out in full sun. Versus eastern redbud, even though it does kind of grow normally in that part shade area at the edge of a woodland, it can handle a pretty good amount of full sun. And then some tree alternatives that are both medium to large. We've talked about the eastern red cedar. I just had to throw that in there. But we have tons of hickory trees, of which shagbark is one of my favorites. Black walnut is a great landscape tree as long as it's not dropping the nuts on your roof or on your car. We've brought in, we found some resistant cultivars or varieties of our American elm, so you can now plant Princeton elm. Quaking aspen, if you want to add a poplar species to your landscape. Really interesting bark. Sugar maple, of course. Don't plant a Norway maple, plant a sugar maple. And then black cherry is actually, I threw it in here. It's not always everybody's favorite landscape tree, but it produces beautiful wood and flowers in the spring, and it supports a lot of wildlife. Our northern pecan is technically a hickory. So, they're sort of slow growing, but when they are adult trees, they are so beautiful and so majestic. Whenever I see one, I fall in love. And one of my personal favorites is black gum. Lovely fall color. It's a tree for bees. It produces flowers that is pollinated by insects, as is our American basswood, a really nice tree that grows in fairly moist conditions. And then river birch. And all of these I've put in here because a lot of them are so good for wildlife. I just wanted to zoom in on that because that was pretty small. And then the king of all trees in my book, when in doubt, plant a native oak, please. Our oak species are They're long-lived and they support so much wildlife, and there's pretty much an oak for most growing conditions. So let's talk about the keystone flora amongst trees and shrubs. So the plum, namely the American plum, that supports a lot of wildlife. The only downfall is that deer also find them delicious. So if you have an American plum, you may need to protect it. But our hawthorns, our hazelnuts, they're up there. Even a crabapple, if you can find a native species for sale. And then service berries, elderberries, dogwood, spicebush, they support so much wildlife. And then the oak is king. It supports the most number of butterfly and moth species here in North America. So that's all just baby bird food as far as I'm concerned, and butterfly food. But I mentioned black cherry, I mentioned willow, I mentioned birch, I mentioned poplar, elm. So I have all of those mentioned. I actually didn't get a photo of beech tree, but beech is another great native for a landscape. Oh, we're running short on time. So I'm just gonna scroll through. So Indiana Native Plant Society and some great books by Douglas Tallamy and other authors. You can certify your native garden through the Indiana Native Plant Society Grow Indiana Natives program. And you can also find plant sellers on that website. And then there's lots of invasive resources out there. Grab my information if you want to find out if you have invasive species, or if you know you have them, if you would like some support on learning how to control them. And if you find invasives, get rid of them. Sometimes you can use manual or mechanical, but sometimes chemicals are the best option if you're comfortable with them. Some tools of the trade, and there is a weed wrangle. It's just get this on your calendar and save the date, and come join us in October out at Thornwood to control some invasive shrubs. And for those that are in Hancock County, we need you. We keep an eye out and look for an opportunity to help us organize a SISMA. And if you aren't in Hancock County, look here on our statewide directory for the SISMA in your area. And then we do have a conference coming up. So I just sending you a save the date. Registration is open at indianainvasivesinitiative.org. And it's a multi-day conference, lots of opportunities, both virtually and in person, to learn more and to network and get some hand-on experience. And spread the word. I love these billboards. And if you are in Hancock County and haven't had a chance, we can share. We'll go ahead and share this in the email that follows, so you can fill out this survey and give us your information to stay updated. Thank you. Sorry for going over.
Thank you, Mary.
Mary. Good job.
Lots of good information. Thankful.
If Vicki was here, she would have stopped me from going over. Does anyone have any questions for Elaine or myself?
We file be made available.
All right. So someone asked if the PowerPoint will be made available. I can do that, but also I think Lace is going to share the video recording with the group, because then you'll get all the funny comments or stuttering comments I make about each plant. And then Mary Sinkowitz, how is that, Sinkowitz, mentioned that English ivy is the bane of their existence. I don't have that particular one, but I do have purple winter creeper, and it has been a many-year process trying to get that one under control. Well, thank you, everybody, so much.